Okay, a couple or three short videos on survey research. First, why? The why question. Why survey research? There are two reasons. The first is I'll admit to something that is true of every class that you take, that probably your professors don't admit. When you have a field of a big field of study, and let's call it one of my research methods, it was a minor in my doctorate. My major was U.S. politics, and my minor was research methods. And when you have a big area of study, you have a specialty where you study more and learn more than in any other area. And in research method, survey research was, oh so long ago, my area of study. So if you take a course in comparative politics, it's about, let's say, Western Europe, you're going to find that instructor who's really specializes, or did most of his or her work in Germany, is going to spend more time talking about Germany than about anybody else. And same for Latin America. You'll find a Latin Americanist spending more time on, let's say, Mexico or Bolivia or wherever he or she has been. So it is for me with research methods generally, and more specifically survey research methods. At Ohio State, when I was studying, I took a whole course on sampling in the Department of Statistics, and a course on questionnaire and survey design and those kinds of things in the course of getting the minor. So that's one reason. The other reason is that survey research is a nice tool to use to introduce something that's really fundamental to the rest of the course. It's really fundamental to data analysis in general, and it's absolutely fundamental to inference, both causal inference, that's where we're headed, and statistical inference, where we're headed after that. And that concept is randomness. Survey research is a great place to introduce the critical importance of randomness in studying things in a social scientific context, quantitatively. This video is entitled Survey Research History. It's also kind of an introduction. So I'm going to do a couple of three, and so I'm going to talk first about some history, then on sampling, and then on interviewing to sort of get us to where the sort of strengths and weaknesses and so forth. And I don't know if I'm going to do one on questionnaire design or not. Just depends on my mood. I'm going to start with history and an important date, 1936. Not even I was alive in 1936, and of course, this is ancient history too. This is fairly ancient history to all of us. The President of the United States, and the first elected in 1932, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he's running for the first of what would be three efforts at re-election in 1936, and running against a fellow by the name of Alf Landon. He's a Republican nominee. You've never heard of him. I likely would have never heard of him had not there been an enormous debacle in what was, in the 1930s and the 20s also, the sort of gold standard survey research related to politics and in particular related to predicting presidential election outcomes. This publication, the Literary Digest, you can Google this, was in 1936 the largest circulation periodical in the United States. And you've never heard of it either. And the reason is because they went out of business not long after predicting that Alf Landon would defeat incumbent President Franklin Roosevelt in the 1936 presidential election. And poor them, they had a ton of data. I should have looked before I got before the camera and checked to see what in 1936 their, quote, sample size, unquote, actually was. But it was huge. They were the largest circulation periodical. They did their survey by mail. You think, well, I would never respond to a survey by mail. Everybody knew about the Literary Digest poll. And this is a time when there's very little communication about presidential electoral politics, nothing like we experienced, for example, last year, or deluged daily with information, polls, and so forth. People answered the questionnaire, so they sent to their subscriber base, which was very, very large, and they really tried to do better than that, to get what turns out to be important, a representative sample. They supplemented their own subscriber base, they have mailing addresses, with information for the departments of motor vehicles. So they're looking at people who own cars, anywhere they could get an address, really. Telephone records, listed telephone addresses at the time, not with the cell phone. It's the wired phone. It's attached to a real place that has an address. So they're getting addresses where they can, and sending their survey out by mail, and then getting the prospective voters to write back and say they're going to vote for Roosevelt or Landon. And they predict based on their gigantic sample, and they've been predicting presidential elections before this. It's one reason that the magazine was so popular. There's a void of information out there, so very popular magazine. And they predict Landon, the Republican, is going to win big. And he lost big. And they went out of business big. It's the first of a couple of major incidents in survey research where attempts are made to predict the outcome of the election, and then there are repercussions, economic ones. So, what happened? Well, let's think about when they were doing what they were doing, and that'll help us get a handle on the importance of this in the coming segment. When they were doing what they were doing. In 1936, we're in the really dead center middle of the Great Depression. Now, probably all of you remember nervousness at home and with people you know from a few years back, 2008, when the U.S. economy and then the world economy more or less fell off a cliff for a short period of time and went into a deep recession. Those times, and even now the slow recovery, these times are fantastic compared to the depths of the Great Depression. Rich people were poor. In 1936, times were really desperate. And in desperate times, people vote, and in desperate times, people don't subscribe to magazines or periodicals. That's almost a luxury. And desperate people don't own cars anymore. They've sold them off. Desperate people didn't have wired telephones. That was a fairly new technology anyway. So the Literary Digest is cherry-picking addresses. The desire is to extract a representative sample from the U.S. electorate, but they're cherry-picking addresses that are associated with people who had resources. And people who had resources were voting Republican, and the many, many people who didn't have resources were voting Democratic. So this really, really laid the groundwork for people to begin to listen to voices in the wilderness at the time who had been predicting this was going to happen all along because of the unrepresentative nature of the sample and the enterprise. One of those people was George Gallup, another was Elmo Roper. Gallup, of course, is the namesake of really the premier survey research organization in the United States. Roper, the namesake of many things, including a center dedicated to gathering and disseminating results from survey research. At the time, they were doing things differently, trying to put together a sample that we'll see in a minute called quota samples that would be more representative of the electorate, and we're trying to make an inference about what the larger group would do. And this really gave them a boost. They all of a sudden had attention, and then they ushered in an era of sort of scientific survey research that's based on quantitative reasoning that we'll see in the next video. Other important events in 1948, and I'm going to label 2012 seminal. I might even mention 2000. In 1948, President Truman was running for his first election, really in his own right. he had inherited the presidency when President Roosevelt died in 1945. So he's running for election on his own right for the first time in 1948. He made some controversial decisions, and a lot of quota samples were showing that he was in trouble. He was running against a guy by the name of Dewey, Thomas Dewey. Never heard of him either. Dewey didn't win. And yet, probably some of you have seen on the net a picture of one of the most famous photographs in presidential political history, which is a photograph of President Truman, re-elected, grinning widely from ear to ear, holding a copy of the Chicago Tribune, which ran a full-page blow-up of Dewey wins. Dewey defeats Truman was the headline. Dewey defeats Truman. That's one of the most famous photographs in history. Really, the Tribune made their call in the election in 1948 based on election returns, and it turns out people in rural areas were reporting later than people in urban areas, and that really mattered. It also was true, though, in 1948 that many people working with quota samples were finding trouble. They hadn't really made the great breakthrough, which is the next era, until afterward, beginning in the 1950s at the University of Michigan, actually beginning in the 40s, but sort of almost institutional. The 1952 election marked the beginning of the American National Election Studies. I believe it was named after the University of Michigan at first. They ushered in an era of a different kind of sample, one we'll explore momentarily, called a probability sample. And really for a very long time, presidential elections became quite predictable. In 1960, there was a close election between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. But many of the others in my lifetime, most of the time, we knew beforehand, based on public opinion polls, who was going to win the election before it occurred. By the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the survey research as a scientific endeavor had really matured and become good. That's when I got into the business in the late 1980s, into the commercial side of it, before going to graduate school. And we were meticulous in our efforts when we conducted surveys to get a high response rate on a sample that was selected according to probability rules. And we got very accurate forecasts of election outcomes, and that was normal. In 1992, when the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, ran for re-election, weeks before the election occurred, he knew he had already lost. The survey industry at that time so accurate, and it was so able to call all of the important states in advance. So President Bush, the candidate, was forced to go around the country meeting his campaign obligations, all the while knowing from his advisors that the data were no good on his re-election bid. He would lose that effort, of course, to Bill Clinton in 92. He's going to fast forward. There's a hiccup in time worth mentioning just because it was interesting. The 2000 presidential election, the one that pitted Al Gore against the next George Bush, George W. Bush, was a major hiccup in the survey research industry related to calling the race on election night in the state of Florida. You all were very young in the year 2000, and yet still likely you know the story that early in the evening the Voter News Service was the company that had been retained by all the major networks at the same time. They all put their eggs in one basket. Retained by all the major networks to do exit polls, to interview people randomly as they left the polls in the state of Florida. And there is, early in the evening, the major networks called Florida for Albert Gore. Gore wins, was the story. Early in the evening, before the polls closed in the state of Florida, they called the election. Be worth looking on Google. I haven't, try to figure this out. In fact, that's an assignment. What exactly happened? I don't know. I know this, that the state of Florida, the race was so close, and this is the point of bringing it up. The race was so close that survey methods are ill-equipped to call a winner. When we study statistical inference, and we look at proportion estimates from samples, you should be able to get a feel for that. In fact, I'll give you a sort of assignment on the side that illustrates you really can't call an election when it's really, really close with survey data. I fast forward to 2012, last year, I think a seminal time in survey research, and it's related to response rates for survey. No, response rates are now ridiculously, hideously, insanely low. And because response rates are low, pollsters like Gallup are forced to turn to sort of a weighting scheme. After they gather their data from a survey, they turn around and they weight it. It takes it right back to the quota sample days, which we'll see in a minute. Right now, survey research is in a crisis period, and I'm not sure about the future of it. The people who called the election correctly, Nate Silver, 538, now has moved from the New York Times to ESPN. Simon Jackman at Pollster.com is now owned by the Huffington Post, and I mentioned the HuffPo and Pollster often in this video series. I encourage you to take a look around, steer around that site. The people who called the election correctly in advance didn't include the Romney campaign in 2012. The Obama campaign, mentioned this to you in class. The Obama campaign in 2012, very sophisticated quantitatively. They knew what was going on. And so did Nate Silver, Simon Jackman, and others who are combining information from all of the polls that were available and overcoming, in doing so, limitations that are associated with such bad response rates. The Gallup poll was so poor in the 2012 election that the institution sort of has done an internal evaluation of its own research methods. That's still kind of underway, although that very recently released a report about it. It's very hard in 2012 to get a representative sample from the beginning. In 2012, you go and get the best sample that you can get, and afterwards you weight it, W-E-I-G-H-T, weight the data, relative to various dimensions of demographic, for example, demographic information, hopefully producing at the end of the day something that looks a lot different than the skewed, terrible 1936 outcome, and yet it seems as if some of the polling houses are headed in that direction, a day when it's hard to get representative data from the outside. I'm going to do two quick ones. One on sampling. It also, these are sampling talk and the interviewing talk are related to history because they sort of move throughout history from one type of sampling technique to the other. And so it's true for interviewing. And the interviewing types, personal interviewing, surveys by snail mail, yes, it still happens. Surveys using the internet, and surveys using telephones. It's the dominant method today. So I'm going to do two more at least.